This conference will now be recorded.
All right, we're going to give everyone a few more minutes to join us, and we'll get started on our cultural competency training very soon. All right, assuming everyone can hear me, I'll get started here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in our cultural competency training. We're our Philadelphia Department of Public Health, joined with by Anna Perng and Professor Roger Ideishi from Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project. And we have a great slideshow to go through with you. Just a reminder that today's presentation will be recorded, is being recorded actively, and if you have questions during our presentation, please type them in and we'll go through at the end. We'll definitely follow up if there's not enough time or whatever the need is there. We'll definitely answer any questions that are left over. So bear with me as I work through the GoToMeeting functionality here. I think I know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna switch over here. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Thanks, Anna. All right, good morning. Today's presentation, Philadelphia COVID-19 Health Equity Coalition, Best Practices on Serving People with Disabilities. Developed by Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project, the Arc of Philadelphia, Special Olympics Philadelphia, and DHCC. All right, so to start off, 16% of Philadelphians, roughly 246,000 people, had a physical, emotional, or cognitive disability in 2016, according to the latest data from the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey. So here we have kind of the background to our presentation, the medical model versus social model of disability. And this is the traditional model of the medical model sees the individual as the problem, and we see here the disability is caused by the physical, mental, and sensory abilities of the person, and these lead to impairments. Basically calling the individual, holistically the problem in society. And this new sort of step is the social model of disability, in that the barriers are coming from society. The idea that society disables. And so here we have the environment is inaccessible inaccessible as far as buildings, language services, and communication. And so these things are not from the individual inherently, but from the environment that the individual lives in. And here we have sort of an idea of inclusion. So in our first circle here, I'm gonna try to describe these things because some people are on their phones. So in the first circle, we have the colored dots, which represent disability, outside the larger circle, representing society as a whole. Our second example is segregation. Here are two circles, one with the larger circle being totally segregated from the other smaller disability circle, and the word integration. The smaller circle inside the bigger circle, but there's still that barrier between the two circles. Social inclusion here, meaningful social relationships between individuals with disabilities and other members of the community, share common interests, belong to a group or a team, have social roles which are valued, and participate in community activities and opportunities together. So topics we will cover today: sensory processing and responses, Americans with Disabilities Act and inclusion, etiquette for serving people with disability, communicating with patients who don't speak, how language has evolved and what to say, and being culturally sensitive and recognize implicit bias.
Hi, my name is Roger Ideishi, and I'm the Director of Occupational Therapy and a Professor of Health, Human Function, and Rehabilitation Sciences at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences in Washington, D.C. But I am a resident of the city that I love, Philadelphia. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a Japanese American man with dark but ever-increasing graying hair with rimless glasses, and I'm wearing a blue-green checkered shirt. I'm going to present on sensory processing and responses. This understanding of sensory processing might help you frame your perspective on how people experience the world. For the next few slides, I'm going to briefly give you an overview so you can have awareness of how people perceive, process, and respond to information coming into their bodies. Not all people with the same disability have the same needs. You go back, Liam. We need to remember that the ADA is a minimum standard. A minimum standard does not necessarily meet individual needs or functionality. Just because a public accommodation is ADA compliant, it doesn't mean that they are inclusive, nor do they meet the needs of the person. So you'll need to be cognizant and you must inquire about individual needs and preferences. And this is why today's training is important and what Liam, Anna, and I will be covering today. Next slide. So what is sensory processing? Sensory processing is how we receive, perceive, and interpret information from outside of us. Everyone perceives and responds differently to different sensations, as you can see on this slide with the various images of people experiencing sensations such as the image of a man about to put a red chili in his mouth as he squints his eyes, the image of a young child covering her ears, the image of a woman with outstretched arms sitting on the edge of a rock overlooking a very high cliff, the image of a crowded public space, the image of a young boy sitting underneath a tree, quietly looking at a book. Everyone perceives and responds differently to the same sensation. We all know the 5 sensations of vision, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting. Well, I'm here to tell you that someone taught you incorrectly. There are actually 8 sensations. In addition to the 5, there are 3 more, all related to movement, but with different functions. The vestibular sensations related to balancing our body to remain upright. Proprioception is related to knowing where our joints and limbs are. And kinesthesia is knowing the direction of movement of our body. These sensory organs that receive this information are in our eyes, ears, tongue, nose, skin, joints, and muscles. They're all over our body. So we're gathering information from various places. Now, each of us has our own baseline or midpoint of how, what we can tolerate as far as these sensations. Sometimes these sensations go over the baseline, and sometimes we will be overly sensitive. Sometimes the sensation doesn't reach the baseline and we strain to get more information. Think about your own responses under different conditions. How do you respond to different sensory experiences? What are your preferences? So imagine if I was whispering, you might lean in, you might get closer, you might ask me to repeat myself, you might ask me to repeat myself again, and you might ask me to repeat myself again, or you just may ignore me because the sound is not reaching the baseline to register the information. It's not that you can't hear or that you're ignoring me. You just might be perceiving or registering the sound with less intensity. So typically, we often will add more sensation, like leaning in, asking a person to repeat themselves, putting salt or adding hot sauce on unflavored foods. Or when the sensation is too much, you might remove the sensation, covering your ears, removing yourself from the situation, not moving or standing very still when you feel unbalanced because you feel like you might fall. You might shield your eyes or put sunglasses on with bright lights. These are all typical responses that any of us might do. Next slide. So sensory processing is related to the intensity of sensory information. Children, youth, and adults with developmental disabilities, including autism, intellectual disabilities, and other developmental disabilities, often have a sensory processing disability. For those with sensory processing disability, they might be perceiving the information with greater or lesser intensity than how you perceive and interpret the information. This perception and interpretation is real. Just because you don't experience the sensation in the same way, it doesn't mean that it's not real for that other person. You can't presume, I can't presume that I'm feeling the same things as another person. When a person with a sensory processing disability displays the same response as you when you're overwhelmed with information or when you can't gather enough information, non-disabled people will often think or say the person is acting strange or the person's overreacting, when those responses are often the same responses you would do if you were overwhelmed or if you were straining to get more information. A person may experience sensations with greater intensity than others, as depicted by the image of the young boy covering his ears while looking out the window. This may be because the sensation is too intense, and a person might cover his ears to reduce the intensity. He's removing the sensation when the sensation is too intense. You remove sensations when sensations are too intense for you. A person who might experience sensations with less intensity than other people, as depicted by the image of this athletic man hanging upside down, holding onto the ledge of a rock over a cliff, only with his feet. I apologize for that verbal description, as that was not a very good verbal description, but hanging upside down on the ledge of a cliff, may be because his gravity sensations are not enough, and this person is seeking more intensity. He's adding sensation when the sensation is not intense enough for his preference. You add sensations when the sensation isn't intense enough for you. You add hot sauce or salt to your food. Each person has different preferences and responses. Now that I've described this greater and lesser intensity phenomena as somewhat opposite phenomena, I'm actually going to say it's not so clear cut as a person being one or the other. People actually may have both and may experience different perceptions at different times. Sensory perception is often contextually based, which is why attending to the environmental cues and conditions is so important. If a person has greater intensity to sound, doesn't mean they're going to have greater intensity to sound all the time. The takeaway from this slide is not to presume the person will always be one way or the other. The best approach for supporting that person is simply to convey, I'm here to help. Let me know what you need. Other things you can do is just help the person prepare for the experience by giving them information about the environment. Allow the person to process the sensation in their own time. Next slide. So think about your responses to sensations. That may not be enough, or that may be too much. For example, here in Philadelphia, taking the subway noise. We don't have control over that overwhelming sound of the subway. But do you have the mental, emotional, or physical strategies to manage those overwhelming sounds? Not every person does. Some people choose not to use the subway. Others use headphones or play music. You might be forced into that environment, and you may not have the tools needed to manage that. What would you do? Would you try to get away, move to a less intense space, cover your ears, or become distressed and anxious because you cannot leave that environment? What would you do when you don't have control over those sensations? Not everyone has the strategies, tools, or abilities to manage these often intrusive and uncontrollable situations. You, I, and many other people don't have strategies all the time, just as people with developmental disabilities. So, part of my message here is to try not to presume that what the person is experiencing is the same thing that you're experiencing. Just because a person is not responding to you doesn't mean they're not listening. They may be taking more time to process the information. They might be receiving and perceiving that sound with less intensity, and they just may not hear you. Then, if that environment is overwhelming to them, they might be focusing on the overwhelming sensation, on how to manage that sensation, rather than focusing on what you're saying. There are many possible reasons. So, even though someone may not appear to you that they're not listening, doesn't mean that they're not listening. So your patience and your kindness, and not seeing them with deficits, but recognizing their responses aren't that different than yours if you perceive things with greater or less intensity. So, don't assume other people perceive the same sensations in the same way you do. Also, don't tell the person what they're supposed to feel or how they're supposed to sense something. Building a relationship with the person, preparing them for that experience, letting them know what will happen without your personal commentary and your perceptions. Creating inviting environments for a person to choose to engage. And remember, there's 8 different ways that people experience the world. And so, even allowing them to have control over those preferred engagement and processing modes. And provide opportunities for the person to process that sensation with their response mode and with the amount of time that they need. If you have any questions or inquiries about what I've said today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at the information below at this slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ideishi. Professor Ideishi, could you just read your email address out loud for folks who may not be able to see the screen?
Yes, sorry about that. It's RIDEISHI gwu.edu.
Thank you so much. And so the key takeaway from Professor Ideishi's presentation is think of access and functional needs as human needs, not special needs. Next slide. So today I'm going to go over briefly the Americans with Disabilities Act and what it has to do with health equity. Next slide, please. Disability rights are human rights. Historically, people with disabilities have been denied fundamental human and civil rights. The 20th century signaled a turning point with the passage of hard-won landmark federal legislation that altered the lives of people with disabilities and their families. So to the left of this PowerPoint, you can see a photo of two people, their arms intertwined. They are visiting the flower show, and a woman wearing a scarf holds her hand up to her nose. She is blind, and this is a photo of Artreach, their audio described tour of the flower show. So in this photo, she has touched the leaves and she's now smelling the scent. Next slide, please. So the ADA, as you heard Professor Ideishi refer to earlier, refers to the Americans with Disabilities Act. It became law in 1990, and it prohibits the discrimination against people with disabilities in all areas of public life. Some of the things that you may need to know is that the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the ADA does define it that way, but there are people who are considered as being protected under the ADA. So this includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. It also protects people who do not have a disability, but are regarded as having a disability. And not all disabilities are apparent. Next slide. So the ADA applies to health providers too, and that's why it's so wonderful that all of you are here on today's training. You know, the ADA Title III actually prohibits private places of public accommodation from discrimination. So this includes retail merchants, hotels, restaurants, doctors' offices, health clubs. Next slide. And I thought it was very important for us just to briefly define health equity. Health equity is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. Health inequities are reflected in differences in length of life, quality of life, rates of disease, disability and health, severity of disease, and access to treatment. And the source for this definition is the CDC National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. And it's important to note that the Philadelphia Department of Public Health has a wonderful health equity committee, and we are very lucky that Dr. Cheryl Bedical has been leading it. She is now currently the acting health commissioner, so we're very lucky to have her take on that role. Next slide. One thing that's important to note is that many private-owned or leased businesses are now covered by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So during the pandemic, there have been programs that have accepted federal funding, payroll protection program, shuttered venue operators grants, economic injury disaster loans. So now that these entities are recipients of federal funds, they are required to provide accommodations. They're not allowed to discriminate against people with disabilities. And the source for that information is DHCC. Next slide. So we're going to go over the etiquette for serving people with disabilities. All right. So this training, next portion, is adapted from the ARC of Philadelphia Inclusion Pass training. So some of the things that we have heard from providers is, I'm not necessarily used to saying, to interacting with people with disabilities, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. So we're going to go over how to be helpful without being offensive. So if you routinely ask patients without a disability for assistance, then treat the patients with a disability the same way. And just like with any other patient, act how you would normally. There's no need to alter the pitch of your voice or change your demeanor. So for example, if you're approaching a blind patient or a patient with low vision, please introduce yourself as a health provider. Do not assume that the people or person that they are with is their caretaker, and address them directly, not the other members of their party. Allow the individual to tell you what they need, and if they decline assistance, move on. Next slide. So if a patient uses any type of assistive device, such as a wheelchair, a walker, crutches, or communication device, please don't touch, lean, or grab them without their permission. They can be considered extensions of their body and should be treated as such. And if assistance is needed, follow their instructions on how to properly support them. And if you're not sure you're doing it right, you can ask, is this okay? How am I doing? And when making conversation, don't ask, how did you become disabled? Or what happened? People who have stutters also usually prefer to finish their own sentences, so refrain from finishing their sentence or suggesting a word for them. Next slide. For people who are blind or have low vision, when interacting with a blind or low vision person, you should still look at that person and face the individual, even if he or she is with another person or people. Do not attempt to lead the individual without asking. And this is so important. I've heard from blind friends that sometimes they'll be standing on a corner and someone will just grab their arm and start leading them across the street. If they are okay with it, you can offer your arm for assistance, but again, don't grab their arm and guide them. If you are guiding them, please describe the environment, such as there are 4 steps below us. And if you are serving as a sighted guide and other people approach you, let them know that you're already assisting the patient, and please don't get distracted. Next slide. For patients who have mobility disabilities, please do not lean on a wheelchair or any other assistive device. Don't assume the person wants to be pushed or guided. And if the person appears to be having difficulty and needs help, ask them first. Do you need help opening the door, or do you need help pushing your wheelchair? And if they decline your help, just respect their answer. And to the right, there's a meme, keep calm and don't touch my chair. Thanks. Next slide. Practice active listening. So as Professor Ideishi said, be patient and give your full attention to the person who may have difficulty communicating. Some people need extra time to respond. And show that you're listening. Orient your body towards the person. And this is important. If you can't understand someone, please don't pretend like you do. Ask questions that will help you understand. Many people with hearing loss still have some ability to hear, and they may ask you just to speak more loudly. There is no need, however, to speak to them as if they were a child. Next slide. Presume competence. We often assume the person that we are speaking with does not have the capacity to understand what we are saying. This is not often the case with people with disabilities. Treating or speaking with the person, whether the person immigrated to the US from another country or is a person with a disability, as a child is inappropriate. Please refrain from using baby talk and avoid giving the patient overly familiar pet names like baby, sweetie, or even buddy. Next slide. And Liam is going to go over speech and communication.
Yeah, thank you, Edna. Speech and communication are really valuable and important elements to the dialogue that we have with the disability community. So here we have various AAC devices that we'll go more into, but these are methods that people with sort of communication, who need communication adaptive products can interface with to communicate their various needs. So when a patient uses augmented and alternative communication, non-speaking does not mean non-thinking. Non-speaking people understand everything that is said around them. Some people use augmented and alternative communication, or AAC. Basic. Picture exchange communication or writing. High-tech electronic devices that require the guest to type their message, then it is spoken, have preloaded spoken messages, or they may contain computer software that offers thousands of words and phrases, word predictions, spoken output, visual displays, internet access, etc. Be patient. Give them time to use their AAC. Tips for serving deaf Americans one-on-one. Always ask the deaf person for their individual communication preferences. Again, asking is really important in pretty much every disability communication. When possible, use support such as a qualified ASL or other language interpreter. Discuss communication strategies in advance, especially when an interpreter is needed. If an interpreter is needed, use only qualified state-registered interpreters. Do not assume that the deaf individual can speech read. Additionally, keep in mind that only a third of spoken English can be understood via speech reading. And our source here is DHCC. Keep in mind when someone nods their head, this does not always denote understanding. Speak clearly and at a normal pace. There is no need to exaggerate or overemphasize speech. Getting ahead of myself. In fact, this makes communication more difficult. Maintain eye contact and face the person when speaking. The deaf person's ability to see your face will increase communication effectiveness, and use any combination of the following: facial expressions, gestures, body language, and paper and pencil. And again, our source is DHCC. And just to note here how ASL and various disability communication can really be an all-body type of communication. So it's really valuable to use all of your physical body to communicate specifically with deaf participants. And tips for serving deaf Americans: rephrase instead of repeat, or write down information when you are not understood. Some words are more difficult to speech read and don't understand in English than others. Consider the visual environment. An environment with a lot of movement, especially when it is behind the speaker, environment can be distracting. Try not to sit where there is light in your face. Try to sit where there is light in your face and not behind you.
All right, so we're going to go over language. Words matter and language has evolved. Next slide. So in the medical community, there tends to be a preference for people first language. And so that is referring to the individual first and disability second. For example, Joe has autism. And so for handouts and videos on People First Language, you can visit bit.ly/peoplefirst2019. But although some people with disabilities and the medical community tends to favor People First Language, there is a growing number of disabled people, especially from the deaf community and the autistic community, that prefers Identity First Language. So an example would be, Joe is autistic. Syracuse University's Disability Cultural Center says the basic reason behind members of these groups' dislike for the application of People First Language to themselves is that they consider their disabilities to be inseparable parts of who they are. So when in doubt, ask politely, and please don't correct people on how they identify. Now this slide about the R word. So older terms like handicapped and retarded were part of disability organization and government agency names and documents. Over time, people have used descriptors of IQ-based intelligence, such as idiot, imbecile, and moron, as insults to demean people, which then dehumanizes people with intellectual and other disabilities. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed Rosa's Law, which replaces several instances of the term mental retardation in law with, instead, quote, intellectual disability. Thanks, Obama. So we have a table here, words matter. We're just gonna go over things to say instead of. So if you're going to use person first language, say people with disabilities instead of handicapped or special needs. If you're going to say use identity first, then say disabled people. Say he or she has an intellectual disability instead of he or she is mentally retarded, or a euphemism such as slow or special. Say person who uses a wheelchair instead of confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. Things to say she is blind or has low vision instead of she is visually impaired. Again, the term impaired just implies deficit. You can say they are deaf or hard of hearing instead of they are hearing impaired. You can also say he or she has a mental health diagnosis or a mental health disability instead of calling them mentally disabled or crazy. And lastly, please do not use functioning labels to describe people. So you may have heard people ask things like, is this person low functioning? Are they high functioning? Or where are they in the functioning spectrum? We avoid using that kind of language to label people because functioning is a matter of context, right? But also inherently there's an implication that there's something wrong or broken about that person with a disability. So please, no matter if you hear it in the medical community, please do not use functioning labels to describe the patient or the people that they're with. Next slide. So we wanted to include some, language around cultural safety when you're serving people with disabilities who are LGBTQIA. So LGBTQIA stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. And there are more acronyms since the Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs issued this advice. So pronouns are the words that people use to refer to someone, often used in place of the person's name. For example, you might say, that is her desk. And you can't always know what someone's pronouns are just by looking at them. Asking and correctly using someone's pronouns is one of the most basic ways to show your respect for their gender identity. And when someone is referred to with the wrong pronoun, it can make them feel disrespected, invalidated, dismissed, alienated, or dysphoric, often all of the above. Next slide. So the Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs also provides some examples of what pronouns can look like, such as he, him, his, masculine pronouns, she, her, hers, feminine pronouns, they, them, theirs, which are neutral pronouns, sie, zer, zers, neutral pronouns, or sie, zis, zers, neutral pronouns. Remember, you can't always know someone's pronouns just by their appearance. You can respectfully ask, hey, which pronouns do you use? Or as Professor Ideishi did earlier, introducing himself and saying, I use he, his pronouns. So it is important to use the correct pronouns when referring to someone because it honors their gender identity and is a sign of respect. Next slide. So if someone's pronouns are unfamiliar to you, there are resources. The website practicewithpronouns.com can help you learn about using pronouns. And what if I make a mistake? Well, if you accidentally refer to someone with the wrong pronoun, simply apologize, correct yourself, and move on. For example, the other day I meant she, told me she's moving to Philly. Remember, never to refer to a person as it or even worse, he, she. These are offensive slurs used against trans and gender nonconforming individuals. And again, the source for this information is the Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs. Next slide. All right, Liam.
Yeah, I'm going to take us a bit through implicit bias here. So the definition of implicit bias. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit biases are pervasive. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would implicitly endorse. We generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. Through research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our own in-group, though implicit biases are malleable. And that's from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Religious bias is a form of discrimination that results in the different and unequal treatment of religious groups. Anti-LGBTQ bias is a form of discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression. Racial bias is a form of discrimination that results in the different and unequal treatment of racial groups. Gender bias is a form of discrimination that results in the unfair treatment or stereotyping of men and women because of their sex or gender. And class bias is prejudice or discrimination on the basis of social class, the grouping of individuals in a hierarchy based on wealth, income, education, occupation, and social network. Examples of bias against people with disabilities. We don't normally serve people with special needs. They should go somewhere else. Isn't their health provider trained to deal with those types of people? And he doesn't look disabled to me. And as a note, I've been faced with all these things, so they're very, very common things in our society. How you can be an ally. We serve everyone. We are committed to learning more and doing better, and not all disabilities are apparent. Be flexible. We have a lens through which we consider some human behavior expected and unexpected. Greetings. Americans may greet someone with a handshake. Consider that in some cultures it may not be acceptable for a non-related male to touch a female guest, or a person may experience light touch as being intolerable. Personal space. Americans tend to stand 2.5 feet away from their communication partner to assist a patient. Someone may step closer, but this could be a violation of that person's personal space. Observe the distance between you and the guest. If you are interacting with a deaf person, they may stand further to view sign language by an interpreter. And be flexible. In getting someone's attention, you may be used to using your voice to get someone's attention by saying, "Hey," or "Excuse me." You may want to wave to secure someone's attention. Eye contact. For some people, eye contact may be considered too intrusive, rude, or uncomfortable. Do not force it. For deaf people, it can be considered rude for someone to break eye contact. It can be the same as hearing a person covering their ears. And touch. People may not like to be touched. If someone is deaf, however, touch may be a great way of communicating exclusively when passing by. And these are all things that, again, giving people questions, asking how they prefer to interact is really valuable. And one kind of underlying note in this presentation is some accommodations are conflicting. It's something that does work for someone that may not work for someone else. So it's really important to have sort of an open exchange of comfort in all kinds of ways. Excellent. Patient service is based on two habits: focusing on the person rather than the disability label, and not making assumptions on what that person needs. So that maybe said better what I just said, but really a valuable thing to keep in mind.
So thank you so much. As was mentioned at the top of this program, this presentation was originally developed through the Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project with Professor Roger Ideishi, the ARC of Philadelphia, Special Olympics Philadelphia, and DHCC. This slide contains our contact information. We can send that out following this presentation. Next slide. There are additional local resources. For example, FEMA or PIMA has an Access and Functional Needs Subcommittee for the Southeastern region. And those points of contacts would be Neil McDevitt, Daniel Kerner, and Ashley Isola. There's also Disability Rights Pennsylvania. And of course, we have our wonderful family nurse practitioner, Tarek Khan, who's also a part of today's training, listening in. Tarek's contact information is listed here, and we can send that out. We also thank Public Health Management Corporation, the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University, Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs, and the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities. So these are all excellent resources if you need further information. And of course, our best resource is Liam Dougherty, who is the Public Health Department Functional Access. Liam, can you say your title?
Yeah. The Access and Functional Needs Coordinator. And I'd really be, I would love to answer any and all questions that anyone have, and definitely Anna2 is such a valuable resource. And Philadelphia really has a great backing of really excellent advocates for the disability community.
That's right. So that concludes our presentation. And as Liam mentioned, so we have about 10 minutes. If people have questions that they would like to ask, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute and just ask your question.
And I believe I unshared my screen.
All right, and if folks don't have questions, are there any tips or insights that you have experienced while serving patients that you might want to share with this group? Feel free to unmute and just share.
I think one thing that we did have that comes a lot from PDPH and Jefferson, Jeff Kent. We have a really valuable training that they created and that we have on our YouTube, creating an outclass vaccine experience for all. And this is a great training geared towards our clinic interface of with the people with the intellectual and developmental disability. And we will be sure to circulate that video as well. So this is input from them, and we supplied them a few questions and topics from PDPH, which we wanted them to go into, and so that would be a good resource too. And again, I'll be sure to send that out to get that to everyone.
And Liam, there's a question in the chat. Can you clarify, the Americans with Disabilities Act as protecting or covering someone who is regarded as having a disability? So there is a national network of information, guidance, and training on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, this is a frequently asked question, so I'm so glad that you asked, Lori. So regarded as means that the person either has an impairment that does not substantially limit a major life activity, or has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity only as a result of the attitudes of others towards them, or does not have any impairment but is treated by an entity as having an impairment. And I'll put the link to that FAQ in the chat. And I know that may be a little confusing, but I think the big takeaway is, when we think about who has a right to a reasonable accommodation or modification, it's best practice to offer it. If they're asking, there's no need to say, well, show me your medical diagnosis, for example, right? The ADA makes it so that if you're a public accommodation, you're not going to send someone away and say, well, come back when you give me your original diagnosis report. And having done these types of trainings and programs with Parks and Recreation, for example, there have been quite a number of people that we've served and interacted with that never had a formal diagnosis. And so there are reasons why people may not identify as having a disability or have documentation or necessarily know what disability they may have. They just know that they need the accommodation. So I just put the link in the chat if people would like to look at that. Are there any other questions?
And I think I do. And please continue typing questions if you have any, but I do also want to take a moment to promote our homebound vaccination program. If there's anyone viewing this presentation that would be had someone in their network who would be who would find it valuable, that we have a homebound referral program set up now. I'm sorry, I'm kind of stuttering. I mean, I'm trying to multitask and not doing that very well, but I'll definitely include more information about that in the chat.
Thanks, Liam. There was a question earlier from Reed asking, how will this recording be shared?
Yeah, as far as I know, we should be able to circulate the MP4. I think and sort of an alternate scenario, we'll post it on our YouTube. But we will definitely be sure to get this training out far and wide.
Well,
Yeah,
I was going to say, it looks like, that that concludes the question portion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to everyone for attending today. And again, we'll circulate valuable information. Again, I'm trying to multitask and not doing well, but yeah, thank you everyone for attending today. And I think it's really important to have this conversation around AFN and disability in general. And I'm so grateful to Anna and everyone who worked on gathering this information. Thank you, Anna, and yeah, and I think we'll close it out there unless there are any more things.
Thank you. Great job, Liam. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all.